Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Corruption Recovery, Development Policy and Women Empowerment episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This week we'll be looking at the Special Tribunal judgment against Mr Msagala, misappropriation of SRD grants, withdrawal of the National Social Security Fund, and economic policy training for civil servants. And we'll be looking at the East African women participation in the Africa Continental Trade Agreement, the SADC meeting on gender and women affairs, and human rights violations in Mali, and lastly, the first oxygen plant in South Sudan. Hello, Sbu. How are you doing this week?
Hi, Sia. I'm very well, thank you. A bit tired this week, but I'm well, thanks. And your side?
Likewise. It's been a very tough 2 weeks, busy, but I'm also kind of feeling that bit of exhaustion on my side as well. As you might know, this week we also at PESA published the latest Regional Integration Monitor, which looks at SADC conflict and political instability. But apart from that, I was also attending or Rethinking Economics for Africa conference, and I presented in a session focused on trade, the informal economy, and livelihoods. So it's been a busy week. Let's get into the subject of this week. Our first story for the essay update this week is the SIU and Transnet versus Mr Msagala. The Special Investigating Unit, SIU and Transnet SOC Limited, welcomed the judgment handed down by Judge Lebogang Modiba at the Special Tribunal, instructing former Transnet Group Executive for Capital Projects, Mr Herbert Msagala, to pay back 26.4 million rand to Transnet. The Special Tribunal found that Mr Msagala illegally received payments from Transnet service provider IGS Consulting Engineers for a tender between 2015 and 2016. The SIU and Transnet instituted civil matters in the Special Tribunal in July 2020 to order that Mr Msagala pay back the money he received. Sbu, you had a point on this one regarding executive pay and the size of these state-owned entities.
Yes. I mean, for starters, let's just get this straight. That at most of these SOEs, state-owned enterprises, our executives get paid way more than even the president of the country. Their salaries are on par with private sector peers. So, for instance, the package for this gentleman was close to 4 million rand per annum. At a fundamental level, the corporatization of state companies and consequently the corporatization of their mandates could be a place to start in trying to remedy this entire malady. Companies like Transnet are big, huge companies. They have massive budgets, and there is a lot of pressure to turn a profit because of commercialization and corporatization. In the private sector, an executive with similar responsibility and similar pressures would most probably be earning at least 5 times the amount that these guys get paid, sort of like 20 million rands, as an example. Now, our executives who manage state companies are enticed by these huge salaries that they're not getting, and so sometimes they see consultancy fees as a place where there's some hidden fat, and all forms of morality or professional ethics are sacrificed now at this altar of extravagance. For instance, our bureaucratic elites almost all the time live way beyond their pay grade. This guy, Mr Msagala, was reported to have had about he has lost about 35 cars, luxury purchases, and he had properties. He had 2 farms, and I think about another 3 gated communities properties. And now these criminal activities that they engage in, even at times include their own family members. For instance, Mr. Msagala's 17-year-old daughter's name was used to buy some of these properties I'm talking about. So there's a big problem here.
So what are you saying is the issue? Are you saying that they're not getting comparable wages to their private sector peers and hence they're getting into corruption? Because for me, I'm not very clear where you're standing on that line.
I'm saying that's part of it. They're not getting comparable wages, and because we have to face the fact that in the private sector in South Africa prefers white managers, and only in the public sector do these black executives get a chance. When there's only a sprinkling, a few of them in the private sector. And so these ones who are in the public sector see these huge budgets that they control, and they get enticed, they get greedy.
For me, I've got 2 things to say about this story. One, I think it's commendable that we are making recoveries of monies that were lost due to corruption. And I think it's a far more effective strategy, particularly in order to gain public confidence that government is dealing with corruption. What we've seen in the past is complete impunity on the part of politicians involved in corruption. And instead, what the government has done is to try and finance the resulting fiscal gap through tax increases. And that's really hurt the consumer and the economy in South Africa. On the other hand, though, I wonder, yes, this 26.4 million was money that was given to Mr. Msagala in form of kickbacks, but how much money was lost in terms of economic value? And I'm not certain that the approach that the SIU and Transnet are following here, by targeting what the recipients have received rather than calculating an economic loss value and making those individuals repay that. Because, for example, in an unrelated case in the Digital Vibes saga, which involves the former Minister of Health, they found that there were contracts to Digital Vibes. I think the first contract was somewhere in the tune of 130 to 150 million, which was soon followed up by another contract during COVID, all which had to do with communication services that Digital Vibes was supposed to provide. And it turns out that the initial contract of over 100 million, they never serviced, they never provided any services on the back of that contract, but the money was paid over. And so when these investigations take place and they find that there were kickbacks that were given and we recover the kickbacks, we're actually losing more in terms of the money that government is paying for services that were not being rendered. And so for me, although it's commendable the approach of making these recoveries for monies that were lost due to corruption, I do think that we need to focus on the economic loss rather than the actual kickbacks that were given.
That's a good point.
On that note, that brings us to our next story from the SA Update: SASSA misappropriation of COVID-19 relief. So the South African Social Security Agency, SASSA, reported to the Select Committee on Health and Social Services that at least 31,955 people had improperly benefited from the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress SRD grants at a total cost of 11 million Rand. So more than half of the improper beneficiaries are in 3 provinces, namely Gauteng, with around 5,900, and the Eastern Cape at a similar level, and lastly KwaZulu-Natal at 5,163. The report follows earlier findings by the Auditor General that SASSA paid out SRD grants to at least 67,770 people who didn't qualify at a potential cost of 23 million Rand to the state. Sbu, you had a point about this in terms of the greed and the gluttony of South Africans.
I was saying that this is the lowest form of gluttony. It's inexcusable and should if South Africa was dedicated to abiding by the letter of the law, lead to direct imprisonment for these criminals. I'll call them criminals because that's what they are. I mean, President Ramaphosa has on countless occasions promised, let me quote him, to work with the judiciary to expedite cases against implicated persons and make sure the guilty go to jail, closed quote. We've seen how reports from institutions like the SIU, they spend months on his desk without being actioned. I mean, you were talking about Mr. Former President, former Minister Mkhize. The document sat for about 3 months in his desk. Nothing done.
It's still to date, nothing has been done.
Even in this case of what we're talking about now, they're talking about getting these 32,000 employees. They will recoup the money. They're not talking about imprisoning these people. I mean, imagine if 32,000 of these criminals went to jail, even if it's for 3 or 4 months, it would send a major message, a big message.
Sure. And I think I'm inclined to agree with you there. And on that note, it brings us to our next story from the SA Update. The DSD proposal for National Social Security Fund. The Department of Social Development, DSD, withdrew its green paper on comprehensive social security and retirement reforms. The decision to withdraw the green paper was gazetted on 18 August in order to provide better clarity on key recommendations entailed in the paper, particularly the National Social Security Fund. The DSD paper proposed the creation of a centralized fund managed by government to provide basic benefits for all qualifying citizens up to a threshold, including all private sector employees. In addition, citizens can choose to top up their retirement benefits using an occasional or individual arrangement. Smoo, you had a point. What are the reasons for these withdrawals and really what's behind this withdrawal?
Yeah, well, first, we can say that there was no reason given by the government to say we are withdrawing because of this reason. There was no reason on their side. But anyway, and from the very onset, I never thought there was going to be support from the public. I didn't even bother myself to try and get into the granular details about what this entire green paper was all about. Okay, I can say that for starters, you really can't shove down another savings plan and down our throats, because this one is mandatory. It would have been mandatory. We just did 2 stories now about how corrupt the government is. So you can't expect people who, the general public, who have no regard for our trust levels in the government are at an all-time low. So those people will never accede to this. Another fear was that the government social security system would upend the private savings sector, which currently provides coverage to more than 60% of South Africa's workforce. And all of that is voluntary. No one is forced to save for retirement.
And for me, I think we're already, firstly, we're dealing with a fiasco at the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, that government is not even good at managing the government employee pension funds, which have been all embroiled in almost every saga pointing to poor due diligence. We still have not been able to deal with that and improve government's checks and balances in terms of its management of the government employee pension fund, let alone now a national pension fund. And at the same time, this again highlights some of the key policy crisis that we faced in. On the one hand, you've got the National Treasury trying to amend retirement and pension funds in order to create liquidity, short-term liquidity for people. And they're approaching an increase in the requirements of mandatory savings for short-term liquidity. And at the same time, we've got the Department of Social Development doing the same, trying to force further increased savings in order to increase coverage for the other half of the working class that's unemployed. So for me, this is a serious own goal and a policy crisis that will upend any form of possible recovery. What disposable incomes are South Africans going to be left with? And what do we expect then to actually spur on aggregate demand? And to remind people, we're still in a slow growth and slow recovery process. Last year, the economy declined or contracted by about 8%. We don't know how we're performing this year, as things are still not certain. But definitely these policies that are coming out, particularly on forced retirement savings, are not good for the immediate aggregate demand for the economy, which is crucial in order to spur on the recovery. But at the same time, as you said, the institutional problems of corruptions need to be dealt with before anybody's got the confidence that government can manage an investment fund for the whole country.
Yeah.
On that note, it brings us to our last story for the SA update, the NSG training for economic policy making. The National School of Government, NSG, is rolling out 3 courses aimed at equipping public servants with economic policy making and governance skills. The courses include focus on COVID-19 and the economy, the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment System, SASS, and governance capacity building for South Africa. The NSG recently launched the SASS course, the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment System, which is designed to help improve the quality of policies developed by government. This follows the institutionalization of the SASS by Cabinet in 2015, which required that all policies and legislation undergo a mandatory socioeconomic impact assessment process before being tabled. Sbu, you had a question on this one.
Yeah, I mean, what is the use of this training? I mean, in real terms, what is it for? The biggest problem, in my view, is that there is policy incoherence. You just said just now about National Treasury and social development doing 2 different things, proposing 2 different things, and the paradoxical approach to policy. I mean, the government is formulating policies that are at odds again with the ANC alliance. And from the very beginning, there is always animosity and pushbacks. And these things all become political. I mean, they will propose this document and immediately there's a pushback. We always end up having a binary between the state and the ruling versus the ruling party. And you'd find some people aligning with Lutuli House and another faction aligning with the government. I mean, there's no surer way of being unable to implement anything, any of these government policies, government mandates, or it's frustrating. I mean, there's no unity of purpose. It's all navel gazing. I mean, sometimes you find these ANC politicians talking about how the Chinese example. I mean, the Chinese, they deploy cadres into government and who they are sure about. I mean, they take these technocrats and they get them involved in political party policy formulation before deploying them into government, so that when they get into government, there's no binary, there's no incoherence. I mean, I'm not even talking about. In fact, there is no room for policy capture, because that's another big problem this country faces. Because sometimes they'll come up with this policy, only to find out that no, this policy was drawn up by Investec, for an example. I'm just making an example. So there's always policy capture. There's always incoherence. There's always these fights and tussles, and all of this results in all of these factions within the ruling party, and in fact they cascade down into the entire society, whereby you get this one huge section of society aligned to business, or this huge section aligned to something called the RET forces. It all stems from no purpose, no unity of purpose. Yeah, anyway.
For me, I think it points to one central issue, and that's why I wanted to respond to your answer. What is the use of the training? You cannot solve the political problem of cadre deployment through just training people, because that's ultimately what they're trying to do here. Is that they're noticing the gap caused by the problem of cadre deployment, in that the people without skills end up being the people in power and in positions with power, and they purely aren't working together because of the factionalism, as you mentioned, let alone the fact that they themselves aren't well informed in terms of the right policy steps to take. And for me, as someone who has worked in government, there's nobody in government who takes the National School of Government seriously. The only people who attend these courses are purely to meet the requirements for promotion into senior management. And even at that, HR has to hound people in order to meet requirements after they've even been appointed, because the policy says you are either, have done the senior management training through the National School of Government, or in the process or planning to do so. So they usually appoint people who are planning to take these courses, who never really take them once they're in these positions, and are constantly hounded until they're replaced by somebody else. Nobody takes the School of Government seriously, and let alone the problem of, for me, I don't think that there's necessarily a problem at a official level in terms of state capacity. Yes, there may be those gaps here and there, but typically what I've found is that at the official level, we've generally got people who are competent and who have got some level of qualification or knowledge in their area that they're appointed to. But the challenge now lies in the senior management and the ministry level at all of these departments, let alone obviously the huge failure, which is that at local government level, there's literally no skills. There's literally just cadre deployment throughout. And we've seen it in terms of the protests in the Eastern Cape, particularly in small towns like Stutterheim, where municipal offices have been burnt purely because people are tired of applying for municipal posts with qualifications and not getting the posts because cadres are being deployed. So at the local level, the cadre deployment issue cascades all the way from senior management into the official level. But I can at least say that at national government level, there is this capacity, at least with regards to the officials. Obviously, the officials aren't all perfect, and there are gaps in place for improvement there. But I would say really the problem is this issue of cadre deployment and the fact that the ANC is a bankrupt movement. There's no intellectualism as there was in the past. There's no, the internal school of governance should be what the ANC needs in order to prepare people in the ANC before they even get elected to the National Executive Committee, let alone once they're in government now. So that's really my view, that this problem is not going to be resolved through these courses. And then obviously the fact is there's just no cooperation. The major problem that policymaking in government faces is the fact that someone sitting at National Treasury doesn't know the full set of policies, or even at a framework level, that someone at DTI and the DTI institution has in terms of trade and industry and competition. And so they always sit at loggerheads because of these issues of mandate and power, which then pits the two departments against one another and undermines the fact of cooperation. And I'm actually very surprised that we passed this institutionalization in 2015, and it's taken over 6 years to actually get the system up and running. And my biggest question is, what have we been putting our policy through in terms of due diligence if we were not doing these socioeconomic impact assessments? The debates that happen at Parliament are nowhere near the level of rigor that is needed in order to ensure that we're passing the right policies from a socioeconomic impact assessment point of view. And recently there was some studies that showed that even Parliament in itself has been failing the citizens of South Africa purely because of the dominance of the ruling party and the fact that opposition parties have not taken an approach of accountability when dealing with their mandate in Parliament, but rather this I got you approach and this approach of calling the main or the ruling party or the opposing parties to task in a public platform, rather than actual accountability in making sure that the right processes and requirements are followed before passing policy. To me, it shows a clear, one of the key legs in the table is missing, and we've got a three-legged table when it comes to economic policy making in South Africa.
Yeah, one thing that's quite funny is that they got the international economist Maria Mazzucato, whose whole thing is about an entrepreneurial state. Now, they all take pictures with her, just for show. You get these ministers standing around Maria Mazzucato taking pictures. And her thing is an entrepreneurial state, whereas the state currently is engaged in a fearsome, in an extreme austerity program, and the two are disjointed. The international economist is talking about the state doing more, whereas the policymakers are talking about exactly. So it's anyway.
The ironies of South African economic policy making. On that note, that brings an end to our SA update for this week. So that takes us to the Africa Regional Update for this week. Our first story for the Africa Regional Update this week is the EAC enhancing participation of women in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The East African Community EAC hosted a 2-day workshop aimed at enhancing the participation of women in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Traders in Africa, especially women, youth, and SMMEs, face significant challenges when attempting to benefit from multilateral and regional trade agreements, as many trade agreements do not include their specific needs and concerns. The goal of the EAC was to ensure that women in the region were fully equipped and capable of accessing and exploiting the numerous opportunities and benefits that accrue from the AfCFTA initiative. Women own approximately 40% of businesses in the EAC region, and women traders face various challenges including limited market knowledge, low access to capital and credit, limited access to information, limiting cultural practices, attitudes and beliefs, and low levels of education. Sbu, you had a view on this initiative. What do you think of it?
I think it's a great initiative. I like the fact that they seek to formalize ventures, and I'm not one who likes to romanticize about informality and Islamization. There's lots of that in developing economies. The informal enterprise, in my view, should be a first step, and it should speedily mutate into certainty and sustainability. Most of the informal sector is dominated by women on the continent. Some estimates say way above 70% of the informal economy is dominated by women, and informality affects them more. So the main problem with the informal economy is that it works outside the line of sight of government in emerging markets and developing economies. This holds them back. It impedes growth. The informal economy also misses out on all these government interventions unless government adopts a broad set of policies to address informality.
Sure. So basically your view is that the informal sector is there, but we should be aiming to formalize the informal sector. And I think that's really the way in which we're going to ensure that informal businesses, or especially women businesses, will actually benefit from economic participation. Am I understanding you correctly? So I think, true, I agree with you to a certain respect in that. But, the dilemma is that, so firstly, we need to understand the informalization of African economies from a historical point of view. And for me, this is one of the legacies of colonialism caused by the widespread exclusion of indigenous populations from economic activity, as well as, in many instances, the dispossession of indigenous populations in order to create cheap labor for large extractive companies that were operating here on the continent, but actually based or domiciled in the former colonial powers as their headquarters. And because of the extractive nature of the engagement or the integration of Africa in the global economy, a large part of that feature and the structure of the economies has remained. And as a result, the only kind of economic activity that post-colonial African indigenous populations can engage in is the informal sector, primarily because they don't have the capital to formalize, but also they just don't have the experience given the historical past, as I mentioned. And as a result, a large portion of the population still depends on the informal sector. And so we can't necessarily ignore this. If you look, for example, at some of the largest economies, Nigeria being one, half of GDP actually comes from the informal sector. And Nigeria being the largest economy in nominal terms on the continent, despite obviously it not being as advanced as perhaps the South African economy. And again, in the South African economy, there are still sectors which are very much dependent on the informal sector. Think of the local taxi industry, which still caters to 60 or 70% of commuters in South Africa, but is highly informalized and doesn't benefit from things like government subsidies, which are provided to bus and rapid transit systems that are owned by municipalities, etc. So we cannot necessarily ignore the informal sector in policymaking. This story to me links directly to the session that I was participating in the REFA conference this week, in that in all of the trade agreements and the process of regional integration on the continent, the focus has been on this high-level macro integration of international or intra-Africa trade. But at the same time, we've not been able to accommodate the informal sector and livelihoods, despite the fact that in current terms, an average of around 60% of African workforces still depend on the informal sector, whether that be the informal economy catering to the working poor in urban centers across the continent, or even cross-border traders who buy goods in foreign countries and go home to sell them to their consumers. So for me, we have to incorporate the informal sector in the broader planning and the broader ambitions of regional economic integration on the continent. But I do also agree that we need to find ways to formalize the informal sector, because in as much as there are positives about the informal sector, one being the fact that a large portion of the poor depend on it, and so it is one of the engines for income distribution in terms of trying to push for more equitable economies, as well as the fact that it does create resilience. For example, in 2020, the South African economy contracted by 8%, whilst the Nigerian economy contracted by 1.8%. And this is largely due to the structural factors of the fact that the Nigerian economy is largely dependent on the informal sector, whereas the South African economy highly formalized and dependent on large firms. So there is this resilience that is associated with the informal sector. But at the same time, the informal sector is that place of extreme exploitation. And this story is linked to our next story, the SADC Meeting for Gender and Women Empowerment. So the Southern African Development Community SADC ministers responsible for gender and women affairs convened a virtual meeting to review progress in the implementation of the SADC gender program. The meeting highlighted the need to ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life, and the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls. The meeting also urged the SADC Secretariat to expedite the implementation of the SADC GIZ project on industrialization and women economic empowerment, and also approved the draft regional gender-based violence training guidelines for use by member states. You had a comment on this one, Sbu.
Yeah, I mean, there is no better intervention than focusing on formalizing business enterprises by women. I mean, the social and the economic are intertwined in my view. There's a Professor Sergei Guriev, who's a former chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He says available data in 160 countries over the last 30 years shows that cycles in the formal economy cause the same cycles in the informal economy. He says, contrary to the widespread stereotype that the informal sector is a buffer that helps to mitigate recessions in the formal sector, the informal sector's output moves in sync with the formal one, and the informal employment does not increase during recessions.
I'm inclined to agree with you, but I do want to raise a few anecdotal points. I think the first point is that sometimes when economists look at these statistics, they don't necessarily dig deeper. So, for example, that he argues against the notion that the informal sector creates a buffer for the formal sector during recession. But at the same time, what we saw, I mean, just last week, we reported on the worst unemployment numbers in South Africa. And we saw that in the second quarter, South Africa lost 375,000 formal non-agricultural jobs, but at the same time gained over 184,000 informal sector non-agricultural jobs. And from the point of view of some economists, this might be precisely what this economist is arguing against, that the informal sector has created a buffer against the formal sector job losses. But what they miss to see is actually the worsening of the levels of exploitation, particularly because of the additional benefits that are gained in formal sector employment, as we've mentioned, unemployment insurance fund, pension savings, etc., such that the view on the numbers alone might look as though the informal sector is really the savior of the South African economy, at least from a jobs point of view. But in actual livelihoods terms, the impact is far worse, because in addition to the jobs lost in the formal sector, the jobs gained in the informal sector are very insecure, and as you say, much lower levels of per capita income as a result, etc., etc., etc. On that note, let's go to our next story in the Africa Regional Update about rising human rights violations in Mali. The United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MUNISMA, released a quarterly note on trends in human rights violations and abuses in the country. In the second quarter of 2021, at least 527 civilians were killed, injured, abducted, or disappeared, which is an overall increase of more than 25% quarter-on-quarter from the first quarter of 2021. The majority of violent incidents against civilians were perpetrated by the Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, JNIM, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, EIGS, and other small groups which killed, injured, or abducted 54% of the victims recorded nationwide. This was followed by community-based militias and self-defense groups, which accounted for 20%, followed by security operations conducted by the Malian Defense and Security Forces, the MDSF, and international and regional forces, accounting for 15%. The JNIM and similar groups continued to strengthen their territorial hold, particularly in rural areas of central Mali, with a notable expansion of their activities into southern circles of the country, namely Sego and Sikasso. Through local non-aggression or reconciliation agreements signed under duress by beleaguered communities, these groups have also been able to impose draconian restrictions on the exercise of fundamental freedoms, particularly against women. Sbu, you had a point about this one regarding the way you view the challenges in the Sahel region and the absence of the judicial authorities.
Yeah, I read somewhere where it said that in the vast expanses of the Southern Sahel region, there is an absence of judicial authorities. Um, Now, that is very difficult to track. It makes it very difficult to track down offenders if that is the case, to bring them to book for human rights violations. And I'm sure it makes it difficult to fight the impunity prevalent in those areas. Um, I think we've had many discussions about the lack of development on the continent. And to me, it all sounds like the old American Wild West of the 19th century in many ways. Is it not linked to development, like we always say?
Sure. Look, I think the issue in the Sahel is quite dire, but I think it's also linked to the geographic problem that you got vast areas which are desert and uninhabitable, and countries which don't have the capacity to control the full geographic jurisdictions which they have control over. And that applies across the board in terms of the Sahel, but also parts of Central Africa most definitely. And what you mentioned about the Sahel and the lack of judicial authority is quite true. You might remember a couple of weeks back we reported on the fact that the Mali general in the army who was involved in the previous coup actually abducted the former president and prime minister of Mali until they resigned, and after that appointed himself as the transitional president in the lead up to elections in February. And that decision by the military colonel was actually approved and confirmed by the Constitutional Court of Mali, which goes to show that even where there is an existing judiciary, their ability to really deal with matters and deal with what has effectively become a coup d'etat is actually very minimal. And so even where there is a judiciary, they don't really play that role. And obviously in some countries where there is no constitution due to transitional governments, it's also impossible for a judiciary to enforce any type of law. So you're right, in some regards, the Sahel is typically, the wild west, so to speak. On that note, that brings us to our last story in the Africa Regional Update, the first oxygen plant in South Sudan. South Sudan has begun producing oxygen following the successful installation of the country's first oxygen plant at Juba Teaching Hospital. The oxygen plant was produced as part of measures to support the country's ongoing COVID-19 response with a $980,000 grant from the African Development Bank and was implemented by the World Health Organization on behalf of the government. The procurement includes equipment such as 240 cylinders and 4 years of service and accessories, and the plant has a generating capacity of 2,500 liters per day and the ability to refill around 70 D-type oxygen cylinders daily. What are your views on this one, Sbu?
This is commendable, and I wish there could be many more concessionaries such as these, wherein the African Development Bank steps in to facilitate development in countries with little institutional and technical expertise. I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of the continent's development finance institutions heading or initiating developments on behalf of government.
So I do think that the DFIs on the continent have a much greater role to play. But the challenge is, in many respects, our development finance institutions are actually, in many cases, just agents of deploying capital which they get from international development partners. For example, the African Development Bank, although is a multilateral bank made up of members from the whole continent, is largely funded by external development or external state members to the bank, such as the US and the European partners. Similarly, with other national DFIs or national development finance institutions, they too rely quite heavily on third-party funding from external development partners. And as a result, they also need to meet those funders' requirements in terms of hurdle rates for the funding, so they need to make a return, and in order to pay back the third-party financing, but also need to meet hurdles such as procurement requirements, which in many instances are set in the interest of those development partners' home institutions. So even though there's huge pots of money that are available, as a result of these requirements, the DFIs are hamstrung and cannot actually play a developmental role, primarily because they have to operate as commercial banks in order to meet the hurdle requirements for their own sustainability, but also in order to make good on the third-party funds which they depend on. So we need to own these DFIs, we need to own these multilateral banks, and the ownership is linked to who's funding that balance sheet. And only once we've got control over the balance sheets will we then be able to allow these institutions to play the developmental role that they need to play on the continent. And on that note, that brings an end to our Africa Regional Update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game. My favorite part of the show. So the number for this week is $520 million. So what do you think this number is about this week, Spo?
520 million, that's substantial. If you convert it into rands, that's about something like 8 billion. So I think that should be something to do with a renewable energy finance or something major.
Sure. I think this is the closest you've come to hitting the nail on the head. So, but close but no cigar. And so what we're looking at this week is $520 million for Nigerian SAPZs. So Nigeria is in the process of establishing special agro-industrial processing zones, SAPZs, through public-private partnerships aimed at developing infrastructure in rural areas focused on finishing and transforming raw materials and commodities. The African Development Bank and its development partners are mobilizing $520 million to co-finance the first phase of the SAPZ program in Nigeria, which will be implemented in phases across 6 geopolitical zones across the country. I think that's definitely a positive development, particularly if you remember what I mentioned earlier, that amongst the top 5 imports that African countries import from the rest of the world, 2 of these is wheat and rice, something which we could easily replace with local production.
Yeah, definitely.
On that note, that brings an end to our show this week.